1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. We thought I would finish that Sunday, but we had a real good discussion on that question of what is sin unto death and a sin not unto death. And so I felt like as long as we were in that discussion and could resolve some of that, then that was a good thing to do. And so I didn't get in a big hurry or anything on Sunday. But we have discussed that at pretty good length there on Sunday. And so unless there's leftover questions, I want to wrap up chapter 5 and then move into chapter 1, or the only chapter in 2 John, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a little while. And we talked about already and kind of introduced 2 John a little bit because 2 John's really just a companion to 1 John. It's a summary of the very same conversation. John goes into a little more detail as he writes this letter that we're finishing up now. There's a little more detail to that discussion. But when you get to 2 John, it's just kind of a summary of the very same themes and issues. There'll be a couple of things we'll want to talk about in that. And we may even get to 3 John before the evening's over, just because we've already discussed the details or the topic, subject matter that was going on there in 1 John and in 2 John together. But I do want to finish up here. Let's go look at verse 18 with me. This was the kind of summary statements of his letter, the first letter here that we've been studying. And I want to make sure we talk about these summary thoughts that he shares before we move in to 2 John. He said, "We know that whosoever is born of God sinneth not, but he that is begotten of God keepeth himself, and that wicked one toucheth him not." What secures us from Satan, the wicked one? There's a couple of things you think about in relationship to what he just said. Okay, the word's involved in that, but I want you to think about it in relationship to what John is saying here. First thing he said, that we know that whosoever is, what's the condition? Okay, so born of God is the condition therein. And then what's the result of that? Okay, right. You stay away from sin. You sinneth not. That's that. So if we live as those who are born of God, then we basically don't choose sin. We sinneth not. But he that is begotten of God is what? Or number one, first does what, I should say? Keeps himself, and because of that, Satan doesn't what? Touch. Okay. So Satan can't or doesn't touch him. And if you back it up, then he doesn't, because he's keeping himself from sin, and he's doing that because he is born of God. And so that's the conversation that John's having there. This isn't about impossibilities and the fact that Satan can't ever get to me. You know, I think that there is a sense that so long as we're staying out of sin, Satan doesn't have any kind of effect or influence on me. But the temptations still come, and the challenges still come, and we have to be able and willing to overcome them. But so long as I do, so long as I'm keeping myself away from sin, so long as I'm living as one who's been born of God, then Satan's power and influence over me isn't there. And we can live according to that purpose. And if we do, we know that we are of God, and the whole world lieth in wickedness. And so, if we're born of Him, we keep ourselves from sin, Satan doesn't get to us, and there's a disconnect between us and the world where sin is. And we're kept from that because of our choice to avoid the sins and things of this world. Thoughts, comments up to there? All right, keep going. So, and we know, here's the second thing we know, that the Son of God is come, and hath given us an understanding that we may know Him that is true, and we are in Him that is true, even in His Son Jesus Christ. This is the true God and eternal life. And again, this isn't something that we haven't talked about before. He's just reiterating what he's already kind of commented about along the way. But everything related to eternal life is tied to our willingness to do what? Believe in whom? Believe in Jesus and believe in Him as the Son. And if you deny that, you're in Antichrist. I mean, that's the discussion, right? That's what he's been talking about throughout the letter, and then that other theme of love one another, which always seemed to me to probably be because there was some strife and challenge when these false teachers were coming along and bringing difficulty in, and how do I relate to all those things and maintain certain things throughout that. But eternal life is tied to God, and because of that, it's tied to His Son. And then what's the final admonition? All right, so keep yourself from idols. Has he talked about idols at all in this letter? So it's interesting, isn't it, right? Because in some ways you've had all this come, and so you would understand maybe if his final statement was, little children, believe in Jesus as the Son of God, because that's been the theme. Or little children, keep yourself from sin, because that's been the theme. Or little children, love your brother, because that's been a central theme. So how do you think idolatry fits into this conversation? Why do you think John, did he just throw it out there, or do you think in the context of everything that he's written in 1 John, why do you think he would then come back and make this as his summary statement? Little children, keep yourself from idols.
Anything that would interfere with your continual obedience to God could classify as
Right.
value more than you do trust God.
Okay. And so idolatry isn't always about statues and images and trinkets. Idolatry is also about what you value and what you place above other things and what you prioritize. Idolatry can be about anything. We can idolize anything. And so it doesn't have to be something I'm bowing down to or worshiping in some kind of ritualistic, ceremonial way to be an idol. Anytime that I'm valuing something else above and beyond what God has given unto me, it can become an idol. Why else do you think maybe he talks about that?
Well, Hebrews says that anybody who sins habitually, there's no Savior or no sacrifice left for that person then. You sacrifice again for your sins. Christ died once, that's it.
So if any kind of sinful conduct becomes an idol, then we're abandoning the very sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. Idolatry can rear itself in different ways. And that's, I think, why John kind of summarized. Idolatry, in many senses, sin is a form of idolatry, almost in every sense. Because we have valued the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life over our relationship with God or our connection with Jesus, and therefore it in itself becomes an idol. And so I think John's using a generic sense of idol here to illustrate where our real commitment should be and where our real faith and convictions ought to rest. Go ahead, Randy.
One is keeping himself, then anything that would cause him to stumble or to go back into the world would become an idol to him.
Yeah.
So many things are idols, as you point out there.
Yeah.
It seems to me like this is a warning. We could talk other places. We need to keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the most difficult things that a man has.
Right.
Has to do in this life.
Yeah. To stay focused and committed in that.
False prophets are like idols. They're trying
Yeah.
to go all the way.
Yep. They themselves can become an idol in that sense. All right. Any leftover questions, thoughts about 1 John before I bounce? I should have paused. I apologize. Question 10 asked, in verses 18 and 20, what are three things we know? And what are those? In verses 18 and 20. We know that whosoever is born of God doesn't what? Doesn't sin. Verse 19, we know that we're of God if we're doing that, and the world's the liar. And finally, he says, we know that the Son of God has come. He's real. Those are the three things that we know there and later. And then he said, prepare to explain the statement, keep yourselves from idols, which is what we just did in our conversation and study this evening. All right, let's jump over then and let's start a conversation. And we'll see, again, many of the things that he says in 2 John are identical. Really, the message of 2 John is identical to what he says in his first letter. The only difference is, what's actually the challenge in 2 John? Trying to figure out what? Okay, who right, the most difficult part of 2 John isn't necessarily the message. And the most difficult about 2 John is trying to figure out who the elect lady is and who are these children that she has. And so I suppose some of our time, if not a lot of it in some ways, may be spent on talking and trying to make sure we understand who that is. And it's interesting to note that, by the way, let me back you up a half step here. Does John ever identify himself in the first letter? That's not a trick question, by the way. Anybody know of a verse within 1 John where he identifies himself? Okay. So he identifies himself as somebody who was a witness, a legitimate witness to Jesus and had connection with him. But he never really identifies himself by name. Does he identify himself in the second letter? Only as an elder, right? Not as John the apostle, but he speaks of himself as the elder unto the elect lady. And here's the only reason I bring that up. Number one, I believe it is John the apostle, and I believe that for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I believe it because the language of these letters are practically ripped off the page of his gospel account. There's scholarly attributed of these works to him, where those who were much closer to his time period began to make record of these things, also were identifying him as the author of these things. And so there's the textual, circumstantial evidences that it's John the apostle. There's the history, not necessarily within the Bible narrative, but the history of that time period when those first early church fathers, for lack of a better description of them, were beginning to record and make note of who had written what and how they were preserving those things. But he's not necessarily ever specifically identify himself. In many senses, it's circumstantial and historically based that it's John the apostle. Whoever it is, which I believe it is John, but whoever it is, he's obviously what? According to the very first statement. Okay, so now we've got to ask ourselves one of two. He's either an elder in one of two ways. You can be an elder by age, or you can be an elder by appointment, right? You can be an elder by one or the other. The word helps a little bit in terms of its origins, not necessarily enough to give us a definitive answer as to which one we're dealing with. I think context gives us a little better picture of that. In his first letter, how did he refer to people? Little children, little children, little children. When he addresses this letter, how does he address it? To whom? To the elect and to her. So there's something very fatherly about his writings and his relationship to those who are his audience. I contend that there's enough evidence within the Word, within how he states it, what the letter includes. You're probably talking about him being elder as in age, chronology, which is accurate in the sense that this was written probably in that 80 to 90 time period, which puts him as an older man in which these were written, or maybe even as late as 95. If you take Revelation as the last, which it is chronologically, the last of the writings, And if you take the late date as it relates to the book of Revelation, man, I'm opening up a can of worms if I get Revelation going tonight. But if that's late date, which I take 95-ish, then this is kind of right before that. Why? Now, not again. I don't want to dive too far into Revelation, but I want you to think about for a minute. In what manner is the book of Revelation written? Is there a lot of identifying elements within it, or do you have to kind of think about it? Okay, right. Yeah, right. And we even talk about, when we study Revelation, we talk about how it's written in symbolic form, much of it, not all of it, but much of it. And what are some of the reasons for that? Okay, so to limit who might understand these things, what's going on at that time period? Persecution, right? And and we're not all that far ahead. This letter and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, all three are written. In fact, the general thought process is that 2nd John and 3rd John were written like he writes to the elect lady, and then he grabs another piece of parchment and he writes to Gaius. They're believed basically to have happened almost simultaneously in terms of when they were written. And so that persecution's already beginning to get a grip and create challenges. So he might want to be cautious as to giving them enough to know who's writing and who he's writing to without what? Saying, John to, right. And so I think there's some reason as to why he may not identify himself specifically, and why he may not even want to identify the person that's directly being sent this. Now, you say, well, then why did he name Gaius? Well, I guess, for whatever reasons, he felt like that was a safe enough approach in that particular circumstance. But he doesn't identify himself, nor necessarily tell us exactly who this elect lady is. But believe it's John, circumstantially, historically, John the Apostle. If you read from some of the scholars, you may have bumped into a handful of guys. I think if you read back from Eusebius, I think was one of them. I'd have to go back in my mind here for a minute to think. But there's some old scholars that have been long gone that did have an idea or think that this was a different John, that this was John, an elder in a church that was writing this. But there's not enough evidence to even begin to really entertain that. But if you read a handful, very few, but you'll read a handful of scholars, they may point you to that thought. So the elder, John, most likely meaning older, and then he writes it to the elect lady. So generally speaking, there are two schools of thoughts as it relates to the elect lady. One is that the elect lady is a who? Okay, so some say a church, that she's a church when he refers to the elect lady. Some say it's a person of honor in relationship to how John writes, that she is. It's a person. It's an elect lady, a person he's putting on. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, we could switch seats. You come up here and see, because that's exactly where you're perfect. You're right on the money. I agree with you. I think you do have to be careful thinking about her as the church, because you think about that, the elect lady and her children. Well, who are the children? Well, some say, well, they're the members of the church. Well, no, they are the church, and if they are the church, then who's the elect lady? And that has to be Jesus, and I don't know that he was ever referred to as the elect lady, right? Okay, so that's why I think you're right, that I don't know that holds enough. I don't think it fits in the description. The elect lady has children. She also, later in the narrative, has what? She has a sister. Later in the narrative, she's got a sister that he also addresses for a moment, or at least references in the letter. Yeah, correct. No mention of a husband here. But it wouldn't be the first time. Lydia didn't have one either. that we know of that's listed. Well, I agree. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and there's uh, anyway. I think enough evidence to illustrate that you're dealing with a person here that he holds in great regard, he holds in high esteem, and she is the elect lady. So John, an old man, writing to and her children. There is some thought that if you want to think about a local church, that there might be a church assembling in their home. That's one school of thought as it relates to this. That she has a body of people that are assembling in her home. Because therefore, the reason why, what's the later commendation she's given? I'm kind of speeding back and forth a little bit in the narrative, but she's told if somebody comes and doesn't bring the doctrine of Christ, she's to what? She's not to aid them, and she's not to bid them Godspeed. She's not to embrace them in her home. There's some language that might imply that this person and her family are housing, if you will, or are the residents for an assembly of people. And so you send a warning to her and say, listen, if these guys come along and begin to present this Antichrist message, then don't give them influence. Don't give them opportunity in your home. Don't bid them Godspeed. Don't give them any kind of opportunity to influence you. And then, again, we're jumping around a little bit, but again, it's a short letter that's got kind of similar thoughts. But at the very end, he says that what? How's he really want to communicate with them? Yeah, I want to come face to face, he says. Very end of the letter, he says, listen, this is enough, right? This is enough information just to give you the heads up, to give you the warning that I wanted to give you. I'm going to talk about this more with you when I get there. And so his hope is to actually eventually be face to face with them, where he can have a more direct conversation about the needs and circumstances that are surrounding. How many of you have ever done that before, by the way? Right? We've all done that, right? You say to somebody, in a text or in a message, and you say, hey, just want you to be aware of this. When I get a chance to talk to you, I'll tell you more about why or what this is really about. That's all John's doing. He's giving a quick warning, quick something to be aware of, and then when I get there, we'll talk more about it. And honorable, chosen. Those are all words. It's hard to know which one exactly fits when it relates to that. I argue that she is as well, and again, this is just the conclusion I've made from the context and from what I can read historically. But I really see this as John, an older man, writing to somebody that's dear to him. She's the elect lady. She's an honorable servant of God that he has a very special kind of connection to, of some type or kind, that he wants to send this message to her. He's close to her family. He references her children, and he even knows her sister. And so there seems to be a very familial kind of connection between John and his audience, the people that he's writing to. Yeah. Members of the body. Yeah. No, I would agree with that.
Do all the translations use elect lady?
I didn't read them all because there's like 2 billion, but I did not go much further, but I'll check real quick. Yeah. Noble sister is what the Bible in basic English uses. I'm sorry. Yeah, don't read that one though. That contemporary English might as well be Brian Price translation, because it's just kind of made up in some ways. I just have it. It's in my system because for different reasons. But most of the reputable ones use elect lady. Let me see. And I didn't dive too far, and I knew this was going to happen as soon as I hit on Young's literal, because there's the word that most manuscripts Greek. So Young's literal, and I don't know if you're familiar with that translation, but Young he tried his best to not necessarily do a lot of paraphrasing or explanations or even restructuring of sentences to try to give them better meaning in English. You think about some of those old manuscripts, there wasn't a lot of punctuation or anything. It just kind of went across the page, went across the page, went across. And so you kind of have to figure it out. Young's doesn't do that a lot. He just kind of lets it lie as he saw it in the manuscripts. And apparently in his mind, he didn't have an accurate enough single or combination of words to change from the Greek. So he just put the Greek right into the transcript, into the English, and Didacia Kyrie. But notice the idea of choice, honorable, elect. It just depends on those things. But they all tend to point to the same thing. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah. And all those things are possibilities. Yeah, all of those things are possibilities. What we do know, I think that we can pretty confidently say, is this is John, the elder, an older man, writing to a lady, a person that's special to him. Because the next phrase is whom I love and whom I love in the truth. Whom I love in the truth, and not only, or not I only, but also all they that have known the truth. So this is somebody very special. This is somebody very dedicated, somebody who's worthy of this honor and praise that's being bestowed upon her. And John says, whom I love in the truth, and anybody that knows her loves her in that same truth, and appreciates who she is, for the truth's sake, which dwelleth in us and shall be with us forever. And so I think you're dealing with a devout, sober-minded woman who has dedicated herself to the cause of Christ and has children, at least a family, that have also done the same. And John is concerned that they may become influenced by these false prophets that are denying Jesus. And he wants to get her a quick message that just warns her and tells her, be cautioned about these fellas. And then I'll talk to you more about it when I have a chance to get there. So grace be with you, mercy and peace from God the Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and in love. I rejoiced greatly that I found of thy children walking in truth, as we have received a commandment from the Father. And so what I appreciate about that, and it's interesting that John says he found them walking in truth. And to me, that word found them means that John may have bumped into some of them where? Yeah, and not necessarily there. He's telling her, I believe he's telling her that it is with great joy that I found that you have children when I've occasioned to be acquainted with them outside of her home, that I've found them walking in truth and obeying the commands that have come from the Father. And so, nice little side reading, right? This just John the Elder, elect lady, you're honorable, love you so much, appreciate your faith, your confidence is in the truth, love the fact that your children, when I've had occasion to have connections with them, I found them obeying the commands of God and being obedient to the will of the Father. And so you get the introductory kind of gratitudes and thankfulness and all that out of the way. And then what's the next breath in verse 5? But now I what? Yeah, I beseech thee or beg of thee, urge you. And so now John gets the point. So love a little greeting, and then but let me get to the point of why I'm writing to you. I'm begging you, I'm beseeching you, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment unto thee, but that which we had from the beginning, that we what? That we love one another. Same thought that he shared in the first letter. He's challenging her. I'm beseeching you that we maintain this new command, which we studied in 1 John. It's not necessarily new in the sense that God had never said it before. It's new in what sense? That not very many people had been what? Doing it or honoring it. So it's new in that sense. It's new in folks honoring it and being able to do so through the example of Jesus. That was new. Learning how to love by the sacrifice and life of Jesus. So he commends her in the very same fashion that we saw him commend those in the first letter. And this is love, that we walk after his commandments. Does that sound new to you? Hope not, because that's exactly what we've already studied in 1 John. So we want you to recognize that genuine love is demonstrated when we do the commands of God. This is the command that as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. Walk in love, walk in the commands, honor the Father. Very same message that he shared in the first letter. For many deceivers are entered into the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and a what? Antichrist. Sound familiar? Yes, it does. It's the exact same thing that he talked about in the first letter. Just a different audience. And so he warns her about the same folks that come around. They won't confess that Jesus is the Christ. And he identifies them as an antichrist because they're denying Jesus came into the flesh. So look to yourselves, that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. First letter, same thing. Remember, he talked about in that first letter how he's trying to challenge you. You have the truth. Don't abandon it. You were taught that truth by somebody who witnessed, talked, and walked along with Jesus. We have those witnesses, 3 in heaven and 3 on earth. Don't vacate your commitment and belief that Jesus is the Son of God. Don't let these deceivers come along and convince you that Jesus didn't come in the flesh. It's the same thought, same warning, same challenge that we've already studied. Then, verse 9, whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ, he hath both the Father and the Son. Now, I don't know whether John used that kind of language in the first letter. The principles were there. But basically, what is he challenging them to do there in verse 9? Maintain themselves in what? In the doctrine. Okay? That's not a scary word. To some, it may seem like it's a scary word, but it's not. What is the doctrine of Christ? Right. It's the teachings, the message, the Word of God. It's the standard by which they just were challenged to follow in the commands of God. And the doctrine of Christ is not something to be feared. The doctrine of Christ, well, we did talk about that. They're not what? The law of God is not grievous, right? That was the way he talked about that in the first session, or in the first letter. So here's this opportunity. Not in the if you abide not in the doctrine of Christ, you don't have God either. But if you abide in the doctrine of Christ, in the teachings, in the commitment to Jesus, then you have both the Father and the Son. Stay with this. There are going to be new deceivers come along, new doctrines come along, new philosophies come along. Your obligation is solely to the doctrine of Christ. It's the only one that will eternally save you. And so be careful. If anybody comes, verse 10, if there come any unto you, and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Godspeed. Now, we can talk a little bit. I think there's some implication here that we could take a broad principled approach towards some of the things that are said here and include in that phrase, abide in the doctrine of Christ, all the things that Jesus taught, instructed, and given to us. But we know that to be true from other texts as well, right? When Jesus gave the Great Commission, Matthew 28, He said, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit." Then what? Teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. So, from other narratives, we can appreciate the importance of honoring all the commands, all the instructions, all the guidance, all the message of Jesus. Contextually, what's the doctrine under discussion in this letter? That's right. The doctrine under discussion is Jesus as the Son of God, and that He came how? Yeah, in the flesh. So that Jesus is legitimately the Son of God, and that He came in the flesh. That's the doctrine at hand. Okay? When He says, abide in the doctrine, I'm okay if we talk about the broader principle of abiding in all of the doctrine of Christ, because we can validate that from other narratives. But I also don't want to lose sight of the conversation that's going on in this context. The doctrine under discussion is the problem they have with those who are deceiving them to think that Jesus isn't the Son of God and or He never came in the flesh. Now, again, remember, that's a varieted kind of argument. Some believe that He came, but not in the flesh, that He came in the spirit form. And that wasn't real flesh that was crucified on the cross, and that wasn't real blood that was shed, and that was the doctrine that they were teaching as it related. That Jesus didn't really come in the flesh. Or that man of Nazareth who did walk and talk and was flesh wasn't really the Son of God. That's the spirit of Antichrist, and that's the specific doctrine under discussion. And so when He tells them here that He just got done saying it, right? And then He said, "Whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ," the principles, the context of Jesus as the Son of God came in the flesh, they come and refuse to abide in that principled doctrine, then don't receive that. They don't bring not, and I think it's interesting because He said, "If there come any unto you and bring not this doctrine," right? Doesn't that feel to you like there's a specificity to this? Not just broad sense of doctrine. Doesn't bring the doctrine of Christ. He was very specific in His language. This doctrine. If they don't bring this doctrine to you, I think John's got a very specific issue in mind. Again, I'm okay with the idea that the principle holds true vis-a-vis, is that a phrase? I don't even use it, but I just did. But because of other texts that teach us that principle, I think he's got more specific thoughts in mind here than just a generic, broad sense of doctrine. He's talking about this doctrine of denying Jesus. They bring that in. Receive Him not into your house, neither what? Neither bid him Godspeed. I think this is the verse, by the way, they get the idea that most come to the conclusion that she probably has a church that's assembling in her home. So it's vital. Don't give them access. Don't give them access to, at bare minimum, don't give them access to you and your children that may be living there, or even worse yet, don't give them access to the brethren who are assembling there. Don't give them or receive them not into your house. Good.
Over the years, we have used that as a principle in teaching people to, if they'll not receive it,
Yeah.
come in and bring false doctrine.
Yeah.
You don't want to hear it. We have to address that and explain what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah.
Over the years, that has been a problem in the church.
Yeah. And I think, Randy, that's probably why I wanted to emphasize that I believe John's got a specific issue in mind here. And he's got a specific group of people in mind. He's got this elect lady, her children, and potentially a church that's assembling in her home. He's got them in mind. So don't let them in the house. Don't let those deceivers that are denying Jesus and teaching these principles that Jesus didn't come in the flesh, don't let them into that house. And certainly don't bid them Godspeed. I think you're right. I think that's the specific audience and situation that's being discussed here. And I think we might make a mistake sometimes of overreaching. And if anybody comes knocking, we send them packing, right? Because they don't. Well, we do that sometimes, maybe for different reasons. But you know what I mean. They're gone. And we quote this text, and I'm not so sure that fits. I could be wrong, but I'm not so sure we can use 2 John 1:10 as a proof text that if some other religious philosophy shows up at my front porch, that I can't open the door and let them in and sit down at the table and have a discussion with them. I think there's much more specific thought going here as to who it is he's addressing. Yeah. Go ahead, Bob. And again, I'll just go back to the principles I just talked about. I don't think so, and the reason is I believe he's got something much more specific in mind here. When he says, if they bring not this doctrine, if they don't bring the doctrine that Jesus is the Son of God, and He came in the flesh, then elect lady, that's his audience. Generic church, we can learn from it, but the church isn't his audience. The elect lady and her children are his defined audience. He's telling her, don't let them in your house. Don't let them have an influence. And partly because what John's going to say later, because I'm eventually going to get there and I'll tell you more about this. But right now, my best advice, my best command, instruction for you is don't open the door and allow those deceivers to begin to have influence over you. I don't think it has application in terms of whether you can have a religious discussion inside the halls of our buildings where somebody who has an opposing religious philosophy is not allowed to speak in that environment. Yeah. Yeah, irregardless of there's no doubt that John's concerned about it. That if they open the door and those deceivers get access, there could be potentially difficulties that come from that. And so don't receive them into your house. And then what's the second one, by the way? The second command, instruction. So basically, don't give them any kind of credibility. Don't receive them into your house, giving people the idea that you're welcoming them and aiding them in their continued presentation of these false doctrines. Don't encourage them, right? You know, sometimes, and again, I still want to stick to the thrust of the context here, but the other command is don't bid them Godspeed. Sometimes it might be easier to say God bless you and send them on their way, when that may not be the right thing to say. You understand what I mean by that? You know, sometimes we might be looking for an out or an easy way to just kind of send somebody on down the road, and they leave that scene with the impression that I agree with them. And so John says, don't do that. Don't give them, you don't have to be mean, but don't give them the impression that you're in agreement with them. So don't aid them in their door-to-door approach to spreading these deceptive false teachings. And certainly don't send them out thinking that you're in cahoots with them and in agreement with them and are alongside them, fellow workers with them for those purposes. Don't do that. For, here's the reason, verse 11. For he that biddeth him Godspeed is what? Is a partaker of his evil deeds. You bid them Godspeed, it is as if you've said and taught and believed the same things. And so we need to be careful that we don't leave people with the impression that they're false teachings, that we are in agreement with that. At bare minimum, sometimes at least say nothing than to say something that might imply that you're in agreement with a false teaching or principle. Go ahead, Ray.
That's great to emphasize when she is a person of truth.
Yeah.
You are of truth. Now you're with this guy here that is not of truth.
Yeah.
Go out through and do their stuff, which is totally against the truth.
Yeah, and you're right to remind us of that because she's been spoken of that way a couple of times in the introduction. You're of truth. You're not of these deceptive false teachings. You're of truth. So honor that. Live by that. And certainly don't become a partaker. And it doesn't take much to become a partaker. That's kind of the warning to me in verse 11. Is it you don't have to go door to door with them and begin to pronounce and teach the very same teachings that they're doing to become a partaker with them. You just simply say, hope that goes well for you. Well, guess what? If you just said, hope that goes well for you to a false teaching, yeah, right. Yeah. 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 And it doesn't take very much false teaching to begin to unravel a lot of truth and effort that puts forward. The error always seems to have a quicker approach and a quicker effort for whatever reason. In dismantling truth, truth has to work a lot harder sometimes to get its root and get grounded. Error can just come along and trip people up pretty quickly. And so I agree that there's a strong commendation here for them to maintain truth and don't even lend your home or your voice to even appear like you're agreeing or accepting of those truths.
They don't come back to you and you think that God's speed. They're the type of people that would go down the street and say, well, hey, back there at that house, she bid me Godspeed, God bless you.
Yeah.
And that's going to cause others to...
And that is a tactic. It's a sales tactic. You think about all those door-to-door salesmen. What's the first thing they tell you? Well, I was talking to your neighbor, right? I was talking to your neighbor Joe, and your neighbor Joe listened to me for 5 or 10 minutes. Would you give me 15? Right? And so that familiarity is a mechanism that they'll use, and undoubtedly in John's mind, that's a mechanism these false teachers are going to use. You imply that any morsel of you're in agreement with them, off they go, using that. And elect lady, you've got too good a reputation. Your children have too good a reputation in the truth to be marred by that. And so I got a lot of things else he said I would like to write or say to you. I'm not going to do it with paper and ink, but I trust that I'm going to be able to get to you face to face. And joy that he said that would bring. And then a greeting from the elect sister. I'll briefly touch that Sunday morning. We'll move to 3 John on Sunday morning.